Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together and welcome Mr. Murtaza Jafferjee.
Good evening. My role here is to set up the platform for today's discussion. Professor Robert Lawrence will give the keynote presentation today, but my role here is to give you a few facts and figures so that you can think about it for the question time. And I called it Dispelling Myths, Illuminating Facts and a Bit of Everything. The first myth, countries that export a lot import a lot, which is, so let's look at a few examples. Vietnam, 93 million population, about 5 times larger than us in size, per capita of about 2,100. Our one is coming close to 4,000. Their exports 100% of GDP, imports 96%. This number for Sri Lanka for merchandise is about 12 or 14% for exports, and it's about 4 to 5% more for imports. So what do they export? The left-hand side shows you what they export. And you can see that there's a lot of electronic products. Samsung has a huge factory in Vietnam, $260 billion. To give it some context, our merchandise exports is about 11 billion. And they import about $197 billion. Now, this color scheme, which is a tree chart, kind of buckets it. The light blues are machinery items. And you can see that some of the exports are backed by imports, and it looks like a lot of components are coming in. Similarly, look at textiles, the red part. There's a lot of imports also coming in. This shows you Vietnam's performance over the years. So in 1996, they probably exported about $3 to $4 billion, and today they export over $200 billion. And also notice the composition of exports, how it has changed. Look what they're importing. So it looks like they're importing a lot of stuff that goes into the re-export. Next country, Taiwan. So Vietnam has a per capita less than us. Taiwan is a original Asian tiger, $22,000 per capita GDP, which is about 5 times more than us. 70% of GDP is exports, 51% is imports. So what do they export? A lot of high value added electronics, machinery, but they import a lot of that stuff also. This is how their exports have grown over the same period. And this is how their imports. So you can see that their imports are skewed towards a lot of fuel and energy. Next question, country is Switzerland, a highly developed country. Per capita GDP $80,000, small country in Europe, exports 47% of GDP, imports 41%. Again, remember the figure I gave, Sri Lanka for merchandise exports about 14%, imports about 19%. What do they export? Gold. Biggest export is gold. But they import a lot of gold also. So the value addition may be small, but it's the largest component of their trade basket. But look at the diversification of their exports. Switzerland, about 8 million people. People know them for chocolates. But Logitech is a Swiss company. Roche is a Swiss company, pharmaceutical giant. Swatch is a Swiss company. How have they performed in terms of exports? And you can see the dip here, the dip that you see is the fall in the price of gold. There was a huge bull market in gold and there was a contraction. That explains that dip. Similarly, in imports. This is Sri Lanka, us, 3,800. This is a few years ago. 14% of GDP is exports and imports is 24%. So ours is 11 billion, significant skew towards garments, but you don't have the corresponding imports in garments also. You have them in the red area. And this is our export basket. So remember I showed you Vietnam had about 4 billion, has gone to 200 billion. In that same period, we had about 3.5 billion, which has grown to 11 billion. So they have grown something like 50x. Of course, they came from a low base because the country opened out. But we went 3x, 3.5x. And this is what our imports look like. Again, you can see there's a big skew due to fuel. So the volatility in petroleum prices has a big impact on the import value basket. The next myth is bilateral trade balances are not as a measure of economic prowess. So there, you see in the popular press that they cite that our trade balance with a specific country is large. I have seen even Trump saying that, President Trump also saying that. But what matters is your total trade balance and not the bilateral trade balance. So let us see a few examples. Again, Vietnam. The blue is exports, the gray is imports, and the red is the trade balance. So for example, they have a trade deficit with China, large one, but they have a large trade deficit with the US. Similarly, a trade deficit with South Korea, and perhaps the trade deficits are a bit smaller with some of the other countries. And what matters is the net result. Look at the right-hand side. Taiwan. Taiwan also has trade deficits with a few countries. They import a lot of high-end machinery and components from Japan, but it's an exceptional country that it has phenomenal trade performance. This is Switzerland. So Switzerland also runs trade deficits with Germany, its neighbors, Italy. Of course, the UAE is more petroleum, and the end result is it still has a total trade surplus. So why do small countries need to trade more? This is something I mentioned to Professor Lawrence that we would like him to explain to us, perhaps in his speech or the discussion. But let me give you some numbers. So you can look at these small countries, the top half of the table, and you can see the export performance. And the combination of exports and imports is the final column. So you can see that small countries as a percentage of GDP trade a lot. And look at the number for Singapore, it's 318%. But the bigger countries, obviously because the domestic economies are so much bigger, as a percentage of GDP, their trade is smaller. Now, to give you some context, Sri Lanka, if you look at merchandise trade, that one showed 14 plus 24. So you add the two, you get about 38% of GDP, while these countries are all over 100%. Okay, so something about border taxes. So this is a stylized example showing you how tariffs work. And the 100% is the CIF value. And generally the highest rate of tariffs that we have here is 30% on customs duty. The VAT rate is 15%. And in this particular case, in this example, we have used steel rods, which has about a cess of 21%. The PAL is 7.5% and NBT. So PAL and cess is what is classified as para tariffs. What you see on the right-hand side is the cumulative effects, because some of these para tariffs, when you apply VAT, etc., there's a cascading impact on it. And you can see that for steel rods, it's 90% the total taxes. If you take out the cess, which is para tariffs, which is outside the WTO agreement, the total tax comes down to 63. And if you take the PAL out, it comes down to 54. And if you take the customs duty, it comes down to 19%. So it's just a stylized example of the impact of all these different tariffs. So let's look at some common things that you consume. Recognize this? Total taxes 108%. Minus para tariffs, it comes down to 54%. Now the question is, why do you need 54% para tariffs on chocolates? Your Snicker bar would be a lot cheaper, not that it's healthier to eat, but it will be a lot easier on your pocket. And if you remove the customs duty, you're left with 19. And where did the 19 come? That's your 15% VAT plus 2% NBT with the cascading impact. Recognize this? These are American Oreo cookies, but you get many other imported biscuits. Total taxes 108%. Minus para tariff, similarly 54%. And minus, if you remove the customs duty also, it comes down to 19%. Recognize these things? Also, minus para tariffs, it comes down to 72. There is a small error here. This should be 94. And if you take the customs duty out, it comes down to 19. And these are tiles. Again, 108%. Without the para tariffs, is 54. And if you take the duty out also, it comes down to 19%. I just wanted to illustrate the impact that these border taxes are having. Now, VAT and NBT are not border taxes because they don't discriminate between imports and domestic producers. This is another example. Tar steel, which goes into reinforcements of all concrete structures. It's a must. And with more and more high-density housing happening in urban areas, you need more and more steel. Total taxes 90%. Tar steel was perhaps invented or manufactured by Andrew Carnegie about 150 years ago, but we have total taxes of 90%. Without para tariffs, it comes down to 54%. So one asks the question, why are these so high? So the question is, this revenue that is one of the reasons that the government needs revenue. So if we reduce these border taxes, what will be the impact on government revenue? On the right-hand side, it's a stack column chart of where government revenues come from. And this is for 2016. Funnily, 13% came from motor vehicles. They didn't get the same number in 2017 because the tariffs went up. Fuel taxes are a significant amount, especially the excise alone on fuel taxes. There are some other taxes also on fuel, but this is only the excise duty, which is a production tax. Then you have cess, which is a para tariff, and a whole gamut of other taxes. And some of the gentlemen from the Harvard team did some kind of basic sensitivity analysis, and they have identified that the top 5 HS code items account for 30% of import taxes. The top 15, 50%, and the top 100, 75, from a total basket of about 5,500. So it's the 80-20 rule, or even it's more like a 595% rule. And the final point is about global value chains. This shows you about a car in Costa Rica. The car is made by Daewoo, Korean company. And just take a moment to see where the different components come from. So seldom do countries manufacture everything themselves. There are big value chains operating. And the second part is that a lot of trade happens within multinationals. We think that India exports a lot of cars to Sri Lanka, right? We get a lot of imported cars. This is Sri Lanka. 2%. But their biggest export market for cars is Mexico. How on earth does India export cars, 24% of their total exports of 6 billion, to Mexico? The reason is on top. So these transnational, multinational companies operate in multiple countries, and therefore they have production centers for different models. So a lot of small size cars which are targeted at the Indian market are exported by these people with a slightly different model but the same manufacturer. So this is a graphic example of these intra-firm trade. Okay. So on that note, I will end my presentation. My apologies for the technical problems, but I hope I have been able to give you a flavor to set this up for Professor Robert Lawrence's talk.